Thanks, guys. Hi, guys. Thank you for coming just before lunchtime. And here I am to talk about something I care about greatly. And how many of you know about what kite surfing is? Oh, this is great. Does any of you here kite surf too, or do you just know about it? Okay, you're just familiar, which is great. I included this picture just in case people haven't seen it. This is kite surfing. It's a beautiful sport. It's a lot of fun. And in the backdrop, this is Golden Gate. This photo a friend of mine took, and it really encapsulates how exciting a sport like this can be. And here I am to tell a story of Alan Chung, who's a friend of mine. He used to live in LA, and that's where he learned to kite surf. I believe in the Long Beach area. And when he came to visit in Crissy Field, San Francisco, Crissy Field is a great park right east of Golden Gate Bridge. He wanted to go on the water and go kite surfing. So he went to the beach, looked around. It was sunny, it was windy, and the water looked like water. So all the three things you need is good wind and equipment and a body of water. So he went out and he ended up, he had a few years of experience, and he didn't realize why he ended up being pushed downwind to Alcatraz and ended up in distress because he couldn't go back to where he started from. He ended up being picked up by a vessel passing by and learned a valuable lesson that even though the bay looks like a calm, beautiful ocean, even when it's choppy, it's actually a very violent moving river that changes directions depending on time. And you have to know how to utilize these directions to your best for your safety. And it happens all the time where kite surfers or other kind of water users, not just kite surfers, windsurfers, small vessels for sailing, even large vessels for sailing. Whenever your equipment fails you, you end up having to make it back to shore. And the distances look so small. And you think, oh, I'm a good swimmer. But it's actually because of the currents, people end up being in distress and having to get picked up by a motorized vehicle that's powerful enough. And at the beach at Crissy Field, we have a community of people that kind of look out for each other, and we joke it's a peanut gallery. But jokes aside, all of us have Coast Guard not speed dial, but in my contacts on my phone. And I've called it multiple times for various people, because even the smallest distances can be really difficult when you're being pulled in a different direction with a bunch of equipment on you. Even without equipment, it can be tricky. In racing, it's important to know what the currents are doing because you could use them to your advantage, or they could hurt you if you don't know, if you don't anticipate the water to be moving in a direction you didn't essentially know it would. And what I thought was interesting is the best way for me to figure out what the currents are doing is not to check a chart, but to ask an experienced sailor, and Mark is one of those people. He's been kiting and sailing and windsurfing the bay since the 80s. And I would ask him, and he would explain to me all the different nuances of the way the currents are. And he's like, well, right now if you go, you need this. But if, an hour from now, the water's going to do this. So, keep that in mind and then go this way instead of the straight way. So I thought it was very interesting. And I saw a problem as a designer is that the tidal currents are very dangerous, and yet people underestimate their power. And why are the conventional tidal charts not working? And how can we figure out a more reliable, accurate way to educate users about how to work with the water to their advantage? And the goals, I did very user-centered design process. And the goals of my study was to examine the traditional tidal charts and how can Coast Guard intervention be avoided, and how can technology aid in doing that. And I don't know, human-centered design approach developed by IDEO and used by many schools, one of them Stanford Design School. And so essentially, first I searched, I questioned over 110 users at Crissy Field with experience for more than 1 year, how they've been what do they do when equipment or weather conditions fail them? So a third had been rescued by the Coast Guard, a third had been rescued by themselves or a friend, and only a third have been the lucky few, which have never been needed, they've never been in distress. And this is an interesting visualization done with data from Coast Guard that I sourced. And it shows that even though the Coast Guard involvement has decreased over the years, over the last decade, the number of deaths has very minor decrease. So the size of the circle is how many deaths there were. I believe this is for the whole West Coast, not for the Bay. What's interesting is that what this tells us is, in addition to other data that I looked at, is that by the time Coast Guard gets involved, it's usually too late. And I'm guessing it has to do with overturned boats or, kiteboarding. I don't have data to have how many people died doing kiteboarding because of Coast Guard not being involved in time. But this is a scatter plot where the size of the circle is how many times you were rescued, and the different colors signify different users. And so my hypothesis was that if you're a more experienced user, you are less likely to need a rescue, because I thought you have a higher skill level. But what this showed is that there's no correlation. What there is a correlation with is the more you go, the more likely you are to get in trouble. So essentially, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And then I did sport distribution. I'm not sure why this chart is here. Oh yeah, because the colors. Yeah, so essentially the colors, the green is windsurfers, blue is kite surfers, yellow is people that do both. And I did some study. I looked back before I looked forward, and this is an interesting map done, one of the first maps that we know of, and know of the humankind. And as you see, it's mostly Europe, Northern Africa, and some part of Asia. And it's kind of interesting. Is it that they didn't know that there's more, or was it that they didn't care? And so that I thought that was quite interesting. And that's a Babylonian map where it was a very user-centered view of the world, and they believed that we are the center of the world and the sun revolves around us. I don't know exactly how to read that map, but that's what I got out of it when I was researching. Some other specialists have figured it out. And the very first time weather was visualized on a 2D mass-produced medium was this in 1875 in the Times English newspaper. And it shows wind direction and sea conditions, which I thought was very nifty. And it's interesting how the designer or the data visualizing agent had to really decide what exactly he's going to show, what details he's going to omit. And this is how cell phone visualization was, this is a telephone system done by Cooper for Motorola in 1973. And it's interesting how things have evolved. Now we have technology that it can be predictive to what a user is doing, what the user will do, and can give you on-the-go advice of what the best course of action is for the user. So I thought that was very relevant to my problem. And then I analyzed some best practices. If anybody here watches the Super Bowl, you've seen this line that moves and tries to explain to the viewer of the TV what is going on. And that's an example where that same designer, that was developed by Stan Honey. And he developed the America's Cup visualization of trying to explain to viewers on TV what's going on in sailing, what boat is really in front, and what are the boats aiming for. I thought it was done really well, because sailing is one of the sports that's really hard to figure out. And he developed this, where before every race they show on America's Cup a few years ago, I don't know how many of you watched it, they would show a little video of what the currents are doing. And that's really important in racing, because the currents are very different close to land. They are in the middle of the water. And also, as the currents shift, they change directions. So he tried to show this to kind of explain why a boat will go this way versus that way. when you are going upwind. And the previous speaker here, I thought was very funny that he showed that, because I have an example. This was published in the New York Times online, and it was a visualization of an America's Cup race. And what I really like this as a designer is that the map is white, land is white and water is blue, and the focus of the user goes on the data points that are moving. Sorry, this is a static, but in reality, this is they animate and you kind of see the little race over time. And I just loved how simplified it is and beautiful and easy to understand. And another example of how currents were visualized in the past, this is a navigational chart from the Marshall Islands. And the interesting thing about this is every fisherman would make his own chart, and they would leave it on land though, and they would not take it with them on the boats, which I thought was interesting. And each of these turns and little shells signify an island or current that they knew. It's quite beautiful. And once again, I don't really know how to read it. Maybe if I was more familiar with the local ways, I would. And this, many of you might be familiar if you're into sailing. This is a standard way currents are visualized today. If you go to the National Weather website, NOOA.org, I believe. And this is an old attempt of mine to visualize, to solve that problem. In 2010, this was a smaller school project that I then made into a larger school project. So essentially, I was trying to explain to users what flood really means. So when Alan CHUNG, our friend, went to the beach, people warned him. They told him, it's flooding, you shouldn't go. He said, what do you mean? I know how to kiteboard, believe me, like, don't bug me, it looks beautiful. It looks really windy, I know what to do. But what essentially I tried to show, like maybe with arrows, if you try to show people what the water is doing, I could see a lot of problems with this design now, but the idea was that this screen would stay on the beach, so when you go out, you can't miss it, and it's an interactive, moves through time. And what was interesting is when I would ask power users, like one of my friends, his name is Hugo, he is a bar pilot driver, bar pilot, I don't think he's supposed to be a driver, bar pilot, and he drives those big ships, tanker ships. And he lives here in the bay, and his job is on a small boat to approach a big ship, get on it before they reach the bay, and navigate the bay. Because as you know, the bay has crazy topography on the bottom. And I asked him, what do you do for currents? He's like, oh, look at the numbers. So he is like Neo from the Matrix. And all he needs is to look at those numbers. To him, this tells him what's going on. To me, that's not how it works. So it's like, how does a normal person that's not Hugo can understand this crazy, complex, moving water? And this is interesting. This is dry ice on alcohol. Unfortunately, it's a static screenshot. But it's an exhibit in the exploratorium, and you can drop that dry ice and see it. The reaction makes it propel throughout the water, and it was very inspiring watching how natural elements react. And you could use this in your data visualization as inspiration. And another example of that is pressurized air through fine sand. It kind of looked like waterfalls, but it was sand and air, which I thought was quite interesting. And Casey Reyes, who was referenced in the previous presentation, he was an expert in taking data and art and finding ways for them to work together. And that's another example of his work. And I thought all of us can benefit from this. And a good example is the wind map by Hint FM, which has been used in many data viz books. You might have seen it. But it was an example how this is data visualization, but people will have it printed on posters and put it on their walls. And how can we create products that are compelling like this? So then I took an app called, I worked with the Bay Currents Folks app. And that's what they had when I had already, in the mid of my research, I met one of the guys that works for them. And then I learned about this product that was being developed. And it was just like faith that we joined forces. And I did some research to try to see how we can improve their app. It was built by engineers. And I thought, well, I'm going to take this to the users and to my assumptions and hypotheses as a designer and see what the best design would be. And Exploratorium took what Stamen Design Labs has done with the water map and the data they had from the Bay Currents app folks. So this is the same data. they visualize it slightly different. And they have this live on display in the Exploratorium Museum right now. And it's great. It was done by an engineer, and I could think of a few things I could change about it just to make the focus more on the currents and less on, right now, the colors of the land, I would argue, distract. But what people at STAMEN Design do really well, and why their maps have become famous and used, is that they figure out a way to combine fine artistry with engineering. And I interviewed Sean Allen, who's one of the main folks at STAMEN Design, and he said, I was like, what is the secret to your success? And essentially that's what he said. He's like, for the watercolor map, which is very famously used, it's here at the bottom right corner. It was a fine artist that worked with an engineer to create this, and it became like a viral piece that now has been used. And it's a really beautiful, interesting way to break from the norm. So this is a result of my research. So essentially, I wanted to see how do people want to visualize strength of current. Should it be a gradient, or should it be overlaying of data points? So most people prefer the gradient. So essentially, to them, a change in value, color value, signified change in strength more than it did just overlaying the same valued piece. And then the shape of the arrow, what should the arrow look like? Should it be an organic curve, or should it be a triangular or more sterile arrow that's used in math, which was the previous use, the product used like more straight. So people really prefer the organic movement. And then I delved further, and one thing I learned is, there has to be a slight blend between math and nature. In this case, this arrow is an example of that, where in nature you don't really have things that look like a straight arrow, but if you can make it more organic, it really resonates with the user's mental model. And I'm just going to fast forward through that because I think we're close to time. But the idea was I looked at all different variations of what the current might do and simplify it. So instead of having hundreds of arrows to look like, can we make the experience clearer and better for a user to understand? And one thing we have to consider is the shipping channels. So what we're looking at here is overlay of GPS tracks from friends of mine that had phones on them, and most of you use Strava, in a waterproof case, and they would go in a kite surfing session and map their route. And as you see, as a kite surfer, you cross over the shipping channels many, many times. And what happens if something happens, like for example, the wind dies, which is very often an occurrence in the bay, or you break a line, you end up having to swim through the shipping channels and are taken somewhere where you shouldn't be taken. So how can you avoid this? And it's interesting how people do not go, so this is usually people ride north of Alcatraz because the wind goes in from the west to the east. But if you have boat support, users tend to venture further down from Alcatraz. And it's because you have to not worry about coming back upwind. And an interesting story is a shipping channel that had rubber duckies in 98 lost 28,000 rubber duckies. And scientists were able to study where those rubber duckies ended up. It was between Japan and USA. And most of the rubber duckies ended up in Alaska. And my oceanographer used this as an example when the horrible earthquake in Japan happened. I was freaking out that radiation will come and impact our bay immediately. I was like, oh my God, it's going to come straight. I was looking at the map. He's like, oh, don't worry. Currents will take it all the way to Alaska, unfortunately for Alaska. But he was like, do not worry. You can go surfing and not be freaking out about the radiation in the water, which is still kind of quite sad. I am on time. But one thing if I were to leave you with is my research on maps. I asked people what map do they prefer to look at when they see the currents visualized on their mobile device. And my theory was that middle map was going to win because I thought it's the cleaner. It helps the current stand out the most. If it's a red color, whatever color it is, it really simplifies the experience. But people really preferred the map that looks like the map you get for directions. I think that has to do with familiarity. And the satellite map did not do well, and that because the contrast was not enough. And essentially, what I recommended is a simplified version of the currents organic shape to them. And if you could subtract, you don't have to show as many arrows, but you just kind of give an idea of the user what the water is doing in an organic fashion. And maybe allow the user to drop a pin in the water and see where it's going to end up. So this uses a computer-generated model where it tells you what's going to happen to you if you have to swim right now. In this case, you end up in the Bay Bridge. And yeah, so if you're looking forward, it could be used in wearable devices where Google Glass could warn you before going out that you should rig a bigger, larger equipment. Or if you have a phone, wearable device, it could tell you where to go to. Sometimes with currents, you might go from point A to point B, but because of the current, you should actually be swimming this way, which will end up taking you to that way. So essentially, using wearable devices to tell people tricks about how to work with the currents. And yeah, thank you.